Hello, now we're going to finish chapter 10 and we're focusing in this part of the chapter on special needs, and you'll also need the special needs information for your assignment number 3 and of course for quiz number 3 as well. So what do we mean by special needs? Well, children with special needs require special attention and support in one of more areas of development. And something to keep in mind is that special needs is really focused on school achievement. And that's what the focus is helping the children achieve as much as possible in a school situation. And what do we mean by typical? How should we define typical? And what is the term typical preferred? Why is it preferred over normal? Typical tends to have a less negative connotation, and so because how do you determine what's normal? And when we talk about typical, we're talking about average, and we'll focus more on this when we look at chapter 11 and we focus on intellectual development and IQ. So intellectual disability is a general delay in cognitive development. Was previously known as mental retardation. Again, that has a negative connotation. But when we look at this specifically, it's an individual that has an IQ of 70 or below and an adaptive behavior deficit originating before age 18. And so it used to be that we just focused on IQ level, but now they've added the adaptive behavior deficit to the definition. And an adaptive behavior deficit is an inability to carry out daily living skills such as putting on clothes or participating in basic dental care. And then also communication and socialization. So those both need to be present. And so today we tend to focus on inclusion rather than putting children who have special needs all in the same classroom, self-contained classroom. And there are not very many self-contained classrooms today. Inclusion is spending much of the day in a regular classroom with the assistance of an instructional aide, and part of the day maybe in a special ed class with small group instruction from a special ed teacher. And this approach is more generally used for learning disabled diagnoses. So the rates of inclusion, 60% of children at least 80% of the day are in a regular classroom. And this tends to be more focused on elementary school. As they get older, this might be different. 20% spend 40 to 80% of their time in inclusion, and 14% spend less than 40% in inclusion. In the beginning with inclusion, unfortunately, schools took advantage of that as inclusion as a cost saver so that they wouldn't have to hire as many special education teachers. And at one point it got to the point where they were hiring very few special ed teachers, and special ed teachers were just writing IEPs instead of actually working with the children. And most of the time those that were working with the children were the instructional aides. But that's changing now, and unfortunately it's because parents have sued school districts. Now they're hiring more and more special ed teachers, and hopefully we'll find a balance as a result of this. On the other side of the spectrum, there are intellectually gifted And these are children with an IQ score of 130 or higher, or who are highly creative and talented in one or more specific areas, such as science or art. And so the ways that we can support intellectually gifted individuals is through enrichment in the classroom and acceleration. Enrichment tends to be much more effective, so going into depth in particular areas rather than speeding up their sending them to higher grade levels, because most often children develop in different rates for different domains of development. So they might be very gifted in cognition, but not so much in social and emotional skills. And if we accelerate them, sometimes that doesn't have the positive outcomes that we had hoped. Learning disabilities are difficulties in reading, spelling, writing, or math, despite having been exposed to high quality instruction, and often in conjunction with average or above average skills in other domains like nonverbal reasoning or verbal reasoning. And this is often established by conducting an IQ test and then comparing that, which measures a child's abilities, and comparing that to achievement scores. And if there's a 15 to 20 point difference, that indicates that there's a barrier, because IQ tells us their abilities and achievement tells us what they've achieved. And if there's a discrepancy, we know something's blocking the child's ability to learn. So dyslexia is a subset of reading disability in which the primary problem involves slow development of printed word recognition and spelling. And so the origins of dyslexia, it tends to focus on phonological processing deficits, the aspects of phonological awareness, and remember that sound, the sounds of language, retrieving codes from long-term memory and phonological working memory, and this could be caused by brain abnormalities or genetic factors. And so let's take a look at the parts of the brain that are activated when we read, or when we're during the reading of words. And so I'm not going to mention the parts of the brain, but you can see there are lots of parts of the brain involved as we click through those. And they're not in the top or the prefrontal cortex, but they're all along the bottom of the brain. So response to intervention is a new approach for providing educational resources for children with special needs. And this is 3-tiered. And it focuses on children that don't appear to be responding to normal classroom interventions, or those that are provided in an inclusion setting. And so here is how they organize this treatment approach. And here you can see they're looking at academic interventions, and that's the blue side of the pyramid, compared to behavioral interventions in regards to learning disabilities. And in this case, possibly they're focusing more on attentional problems for the behavioral interventions rather than academic. And so you can see that on the bottom, we'll click through this, they're actually going to start at the top, and the intensive individual interventions, like focusing on individual students and making sure the interventions are based on their assessments, and making sure that they're really doing high intensity interventions for longer periods of time. And that's about 5%. And then the next tier would be some students who are at risk, and this is 15%, focusing on high efficiency interventions with rapid response. And then the core instructional interventions with all students that are preventative and proactive. And then you're going to see the same kind of pattern on the other side with behavioral interventions. And so another category is attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity, or ADHD. And this is characterized by inattention and hyperactivity and or impulsivity. And so to be diagnosed in this area, symptoms need to be present in more than one situation, so not just at school, but at home. They need to be present for at least 6 months, and they require ratings completed by parents and teachers. And by the way, this ADHD by itself, without other diagnoses, do not qualify a child for special education programming. So oftentimes what has to happen is a Section 504 behavioral plan or accommodation plan has to be created, and this has to do with equal opportunities. And so if a child doesn't qualify with ADHD, doesn't qualify for special education services with an IEP, they can have a 504 accommodation plan. So some interventions for ADHD would be medication, psychotherapy, or behavioral management. And what tends to work best is a balance of actually medication and behavior management, so that with medication you're controlling the symptoms but not providing skills for the child to adapt. And so if you do a combination of treating the symptoms and then giving them skills and behavioral management so that they can manage their own behavior and focus, it tends to be more effective. And the concerns with medication is that the medication provided for ADHD affects appetite. It lowers children's appetite and hydration level, and that affects their growth and development. And so you want to make sure that the medication isn't causing more problems than it's helping. Okay, so here we have a study that was conducted that compared different approaches and the outcomes. And they're looking at the length of time of the treatment. And so 14 months is red and 24 months is blue. And they're looking at community treatment along the bottom and behavioral intervention only, medication only, and then combined. And then on the left-hand side, we're looking at the percentage of participation. And so here we can see that the combined actually worked best in 14-month period, and then also a 24-month period when you compare the length of time, and that community treatment by itself was least effective. Behavioral intervention only came next. And meditation showed a decrease if you're doing medication by itself over 2 years. It was effective for 14 months, but then its effectiveness went down. Seems like 14 months in the combined was also more effective.